What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Here we go talking about motor behavior and introduction. Let's get it popping. To start, let's focus on studying motor skills. And to start this off here, we need a few different definitions. First of all, motor behavior. Okay, it's just kind of a general term there for any sort of actions or behaviors that lead to some sort of movement there. Okay? In order to have motor behavior there, we need motor control, okay, which is considered the process of initiating, directing, and grading purposeful voluntary movement. Okay, purposeful meaning with a purpose there, not just some random movement. Okay, purposeful, wanting a specific outcome there. Okay, and motor control involves muscles and nerve impulses there. Motor development is the change in your motor behavior across someone's lifespan. Okay, and what happens with the sequential, continuous, and age-related processes of change. So how does motor development, what does it look like from 5 years old to a teenager to adulthood, okay, to late adulthood there. Motor learning is a relatively permanent change in the ability to execute some sort of motor skill as a result of practice or experience. So the more practice you do on something, typically we would think that more motor learning would have occurred. And then motor performance specifically is the act of executing a motor skill that results in a temporary, non-permanent change. So just because you execute some sort of skill doesn't necessarily mean the change is permanent there. For example, if I bench press 100 pounds one time there, okay, that's motor performance, okay? I executed that, okay, but I might not necessarily be stronger due to that execution of one rep on bench press for 100 pounds there. So motor performance is just performing some sort of action. Now let's understand there's a difference between skill and movement, okay? Skills are not the same as movements, although all motor skills consist of at least one sort of movement here, okay? The difference between skill and movement there is 4 different categories. I want to make sure to write this down somewhere. So first, a skill has some sort of desired environmental goal. There's some purpose for executing the skill. It's not just some random movement there. A skill there has a specific purpose. Okay? A skill, number 2 there, attempts to meet this goal with as much certainty as possible. Okay? So again, it's not just randomly we're successful with the skill. We're trying to achieve some sort of specific goal there, and we're trying to execute it with as much certainty as possible. A skill generally attempts to minimize or conserve energy. So basically, for example here, if I'm running, every step I take when I'm running, I don't want to expend a ton of energy with every step, because if I do that, I will tire out very quickly. So I want to improve my technique so that I can efficiently run, okay, without expending as much or without expending too much energy there. And fourth there, a skill generally attempts to minimize time. For example here, if I'm trying to run, to be more skillful at running, I would be running faster. Okay, so some skills typically want to minimize the amount of time spent, okay, executing that particular skill. So the less time it takes to execute a skill there, okay, typically the more skillful a person will be. Now we'll talk about a little bit later here. There is a trade-off between speed and accuracy. So sometimes less time is not necessarily always better. Now with skills here, we typically have 2 different categories, open versus closed. And an open skill, okay, the environment that the skill is being performed in is variable and is unpredictable during the action. Okay, so therefore, due to the unpredictability, we cannot effectively plan the entire movement in advance. Okay, here are a couple examples of open skills. Most actions in team sports, okay, because you don't know what the opponent is going to do in that particular sport. For example, okay, if I'm guarding someone who has the ball in basketball, I don't know whether the person who has the basketball is going to move to the right, to the left. Are they going to shoot the ball? Or are they going to pass the ball? So it's unpredictable what the particular person is doing. So I have to be ready for a bunch of different scenarios. So that's why guarding someone in basketball would be an example of an open skill. Another example would be driving in traffic, because you don't know what the other people are going to do. You can maybe predict what they're probably going to do. For example, people coming to the left and to the right of you will probably stop at a stop sign, but they might not. They might run that stop sign. So there's some sort of degree of uncertainty about what the other cars are going to do. Therefore, it's considered an open skill. So being successful executing open skills is mainly determined by the extent to which the individual is successful in adapting whatever planned motor behavior there is to the different changing environments. So basically, how well, for example, in basketball, can a person shoot the ball depending if they're near the basket, far the basket, are they running to the left or to the right, are they receiving a pass and then shooting it there? Okay. So how well the shooter there can adapt to getting the ball and moving in different situations before shooting and executing that shot there, okay, that determines the success for people performing open skills. Now understand here, skills aren't necessarily completely open or completely closed. Okay, open skills are one end of this continuum of skills, and at the opposite end would be considered closed skills. A perfectly closed skill would be something where the environment is stable and predictable. Therefore, if we know what environment we're in and we can predict very accurately what's going to happen, our movements can be planned in advance. Predictability is the most important feature of closed skills when comparing them to open skills. Here, a couple examples of closed skills. Okay, number one, shooting a free throw. When you shoot a free throw, okay, typically you shoot free throws, okay, indoors. Typically, or you will shoot a free throw from the same distance, unless you're maybe Pee Wee League and they've moved up the free throw line. You have the same size ball, with roughly the same amount of grip there, and you have 10 seconds, the same amount of time to shoot that free throw you would have in any other situation. So that's a closed skill, okay? We know what we're going to do, so therefore it's very predictable. That's why free throw shooting is an example of a closed skill. Another example of a closed skill would be sending a text message, because you know exactly where those keys are on your phone there. So you know where the keys are, you know which words you want to create, you know where you need to tap the keys to create those letters there, and you know where you need to press send there. So it's very predictable. We know the keys are in the same position every time. So therefore, sending a text message would be an example of a closed skill. So being successful in closed skills requires that consistent, stable, predictable environment there to be successful. So closed skills are going to be on the opposite end of the continuum compared to open skills. Now again, with vast majority of skills there, I'd say 99.9% of them, most of them won't neatly fall in either an open skill or a closed skill category. Okay, there might be some degrees of predictability in a skill, okay, versus there might be some degree of unpredictability. Okay, and that mainly depends on the environment, okay, or it depends on the opponents that you're competing against. So here are some examples of looking at closed skills in a very predictable environment versus open skills in an unpredictable environment. So gymnastics, very predictable environment. We know which surface we're performing on. The apparatuses are set to the same dimensions every time, okay? And you know what routine you're going to do. Archery, okay? You know what bow you've got, you know what arrows you've got, you know the distance which you need to shoot at. Playing the soccer, again, would be unpredictable because you got to react to an opponent. Wrestling, reacting to an opponent there. But there are some sort of semi-predictable environments as well. For example, steering a car. You know, in general, people will be driving on the roads, in the lines. They have to stop at stop signs, okay? But different cars might be moving at different speeds than what you might be predicting. So therefore, some sort of a semi-predictable environment. So again, skills will fall along this continuum there, depending if they're more closed or more open. Another category of skills is we've got some other comparisons include discrete skills. So with discrete skills, they have a specified beginning and a specified end there. Okay? And oftentimes discrete skills of very brief duration. Here are some examples of discrete skills. Throwing and kicking a ball. Okay? For example, if I'm kicking a soccer ball, okay, so the start there is I swing my leg back, and my finish is on the follow-through of kicking that ball. Okay? So there's a start, swinging the leg back, finish on the follow-through. Blinking an eye. Eye starts open, closes, and then goes back open again. So start, eyes open, finishing with eyes open with that blink in between. Pressing a button, doing a cartwheel, these are all examples of discrete skills because they have a specific start and end, and oftentimes they're a very brief duration in nature. Now, the opposite end would be continuous skills. So instead of having a specific beginning or end, there is no particular beginning or end in a continuous skill. Okay? The behavior will continue going on and on and on until it's stopped at some point in time there. But the key thing is this skill is repeated over and over and over again continuously. Here are some examples of continuous skills. Swimming, running, or biking, for example. With swimming, I'm constantly circling my arms, pulling the water so that I can move throughout the body, and I repeat it over and over and over again. Steering a car is an example of a continuous skill because I'm constantly adjusting that wheel there a little bit to make sure my car is driving along the road there. Sewing or knitting is an example. Jumping rope is an example. So continuous skills would be on the opposite end of the continuum compared to discrete skills. Okay. And then serial skills is essentially kind of the midpoint or middle point between continuous and discrete skills. So what serial skills is a set of discrete skills put together to create some sort of whole or some sort of complicated skill action there. Okay. So serial skills may be long in duration, but it does not stop arbitrarily or randomly there. Okay. There's a specific starting and end point. A great example of a set of serial skills would be a gymnastics routine. Okay. Because, for example, a gymnastics routine, maybe you're on the floor there, and you want to do a tumbling pass. And this tumbling pass consists of running, to do a cartwheel, okay, to do a somersault, and to a back handspring, and then you land it. So those are a set of bunch of different discrete skills, but you put them all together in one fluid movement there to go from start to the end of your tumbling pass there. So again, serial skills fall in the middle of a continuum there between discrete skills and continuous skills. Again, you can look at a few different examples of what discrete skills would be, serial and continuous skills. So how do we assess how skilled someone is? So what does make someone very skilled, and how does that compare to someone who's very unskilled? Okay? And a couple ways we can do this is looking at time and speed. Okay? Typically, in general, a more skilled performer will be able to accomplish more in less time, or is able to move much faster there. Okay? Those people are considered to be more skillful. Now, this is not always the case, as movement quality often matters. For example, in gymnastics, how well you move, okay, the quality of your movement scores higher than necessarily just performing that movement faster. Okay. Also, in some situations, it's sometimes beneficial to trade off speed for accuracy. For example, the biathlon. It's a cross-country ski race where people ski around, and at certain points in the race there, they have targets they have to shoot. And for every missed target there, certain amount of time is added to their total time. So there's a penalty if they do not hit their target there. So therefore, in this case, it might be better to slow down a little bit, okay, before they take their shot. So that way they might spend a little more time setting up for their shot, but they'll save more time in the long run because they hit their target instead of missing it and avoid that time penalty. Another example is a penalty kick in soccer. Penalty kick in soccer there, you've got several seconds there before you actually have to shoot the ball. So it's not like you have to shoot it very quickly immediately when the ref blows his whistle. You've got some time there to set up your shot. So therefore, penalty kick, you might need to spend more time preparing for your shot in order to be more accurate. In addition, okay, if you take some speed off the ball, maybe you can place the ball in the upper corners or lower corners there of the goal, therefore making it more difficult for the goalie to block your shot. Now, you might be less accurate if you shot the ball with more velocity there. So by taking off some velocity, you might be able to place the ball more accurately, therefore being more successful in shooting the goal. So in order to assess their time and speed there, we often need to look at reaction time. And what reaction time is the time it takes from a signal or a stimulus there to the beginning of a response. Okay? Not the response actually moving, but to the beginning of it. Okay? And then movement time there is the total amount of time it takes to execute that particular skill. So if we take reaction time plus the movement time, that in total gives us our response time. Now, oftentimes when we're moving there, we have a primary task that we need to execute there, but we oftentimes might need to execute some sort of secondary tasks as well. Okay, so how do we assess differences in skill and performance in tasks that are well learned? Okay, so for example, some people, when you're just practicing, shooting a basketball, you might have a high-level performer and a moderate-level performer, both able to shoot the ball very well in a practice environment. Okay? But oftentimes the more advanced performer there will be able to shoot the ball much better in a game environment. Okay? And in order to execute more skillfully in a game environment for that more advanced athlete compared to the moderate athlete, is that in the game environment, there are secondary tasks that must be executed, while shooting the ball. For example, looking for open teammates, maybe running with the ball. Compared to the moderate person in practice there, they don't have to deal with all those other variables there. So with secondary tasks there, may be able to differentiate between a skilled performer and a unskilled performer. Here are another example of some secondary tasks. So for example, the primary task might be running, the secondary task is dribbling a basketball. So as the conditions in that secondary task become more challenging, we will be more likely that you'll see errors in this secondary task. So, for example there, because dribbling a basketball there, is pretty complicated in nature, if you are dribbling a basketball in place, it's probably pretty easy. But if you're running and dribbling a basketball, you might make more errors if you're not very skilled at dribbling the basketball if you start to run. Next up we'll talk about is the information processing portion of reaction time and decision making. So this is a simplified model there of the information processing model. You got some sort of input, you got the human element, and from there the human executes some sort of output there. So input, human, output. And just focus on the middle portion there, the human element, is we look at the human element and we can break it down into three different stages. We got stimulus identification, response selection, and then movement programming. And this would make sense here. When you receive some sort of input, the stimulus in that input must first be identified. And once you identify what that stimulus is, we have to pick a response from all possible responses that we could have to that particular stimulus. And then once we select a response there, the actual physical movement is programmed, although the movement itself would be the actual output. So we program the physical movement, but we don't actually start moving there, and that's going to be the third stage there. Now understand that these stages are not directly observable, We can infer that knowledge is happening from that behavior under experimental conditions, but we cannot see actually in real time when does the stimulus identification start and stop, when does response selection start and stop, and when does movement programming start and stop. We can assume, and in this model there, is that the stages of stimulus identification, response selection, movement programming are serial, meaning they happen in series or one after the other, and we assume that they are not parallel. So here's an example of this, the human portion there. So let's say we're starting a 100-meter sprint. The stimulus identification is the gunshot. So we hear the gunshot, that's identifying the stimulus. Then we need to choose a response there. Our response will be choosing to move, versus just staying still. So our response could be moving or just staying still. And then movement programming is we're going to choose how we're going to move. And I would choose out of all the options there, we're going to choose to sprint straight ahead versus maybe we're choosing the sprint to the side, maybe we're deciding to shuffle, maybe we're deciding to backpedal. Out of all those different options, we're going to choose to sprint straight ahead. So we're going to program that movement, but we're not actually starting to sprint yet. So those are the three different phases there, in the human element there of this model. So we talked about processing information in serial versus parallel. Serial means series, okay? And we're assuming with this model there in the human portions that the stages are serial in nature, meaning one step is completed prior to the next stage occurring. Okay? Now, in motor behavior there, okay, a lot of processes that occur in parallel, meaning that they're occurring at the same time. For our model, however, okay, it makes logical sense that you cannot select a response without knowing what the stimulus is. And we cannot program a response prior to selecting that particular response. So for now here, we will assume that this is a serial process in nature. So the output portion is the actual production of movement. Okay, so when we're actually moving. We will only address briefly this portion of our model, as for this portion of the course here, we're more concerned with processing the information, as that's what is involved in when we look at reaction time. An examination of the output would primarily fall under the category of motor control. But again, we're not going to focus so much on the output, we're going to focus on the information processing portion. So reaction time, again, is a measure of the time it takes from the arrival of the signal to the beginning of the movement response to it. Okay? And with reaction time, we kind of got two different categories of reaction time. We've got simple versus choice reaction time. Simple reaction time would be occurring when there's only one possible response available. For example, there in the start of a 100-meter sprint, we hear the gun go off, and our only choice to respond is sprinting straight ahead. Now, choice reaction time would be, is there are multiple options you can choose in your response there, okay? So for example, if you receive a basketball pass, that's your stimulus, okay? From there, we can decide whether we want to shoot it, maybe dribble, maybe we're going to hold on to it, maybe we're going to pass the ball, and various other options there. So choice reaction time means we have several different options or choices to decide on how we are going to react. Reaction time is used extensively as a measure of information processing speed, primarily for two reasons. Okay? First of all, reaction time measures are components of real-life tasks, so they have high face validity, meaning that we have a lot of different situations in our lives, and how quickly we can respond to those stimuli, okay, will determine whether we're successful or not. And they happen a lot of times in real-life tasks. Okay? Second thing is that reaction time is presumably a measurement of the stimulus identification, response selection, and movement programming, essentially the human portion of our model. Okay? So that's why we're using reaction time, okay, as a measure there of measuring how much our information processing speed is effective. So looking at stimulus identification. If we're going to react to when a stimulus is presented, okay, we have to have two different things there. Number one is this stimulus has to be detected, and we have to recognize that it's actually a stimulus there. Okay. When detecting that stimulus, okay, there are neurological impulses that are sent to our brain, okay, upon detection of that stimulus. Okay. And we presume that it's going to be processed into our brain until it connects with the memory portion of our brain. Okay. And that's due to some memorized aspect of the stimulus is aroused. Maybe it's hearing our name, maybe we attribute it to something or whatnot. The modality, or essentially which sense we receive the stimulus, whether it be sight, touch, taste, smell, okay, this matters for reaction time. Reaction time is typically faster when the stimulus occurs in more than one modality. For example, if you see a stimulus and hear it at the same time, your reaction time will be faster compared to if you only see it versus if you only hear it or if you only smell it, something along those lines. So the more senses we can involve in the detection of the stimulus, the faster our reaction time is going to be. We talked about recognition there, okay? Oftentimes for a stimulus for us to react to it properly, we need to recognize the pattern in which the stimulus comes to us, okay? And our reaction may either be genetic in nature or learned, okay? For example, an example of a genetic pattern recognition is our flinch response. So for example, if someone moves their hand close to my eyes there, and my eyes detect it there, and I identify it, my reaction to it would be blinking, okay? And again, this is not learned here, it's just genetic. Something flies close to my face, I blink to protect my eyes. That is genetic in nature. They're also good, we could recognize some patterns in sort of a learned format. For example, gameplay. For example, if I'm in soccer there and I'm running down on a fast break opportunity, okay, I can see when that ball is passed to me, and I know how fast I need to run based off of the person who has the ball, okay, and based off where my opponents are in the game there. So I've learned this through playing games. Through playing games, I've learned how to react in a fast break opportunity. With pattern recognition, we can gain information from static positions, for example, looking at a chessboard there, or from a changing environment, for example, there in soccer. So once we identify their stimulus there, the individual knows what happened in the environment, and therefore we need to decide what response to take. Okay? And here are a couple different factors there that contribute to increasing reaction time. Okay? Number one is the number of stimulus to response alternatives, SR, stimulus and response. Okay? Hicks' law there and the effects of practice, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the PowerPoint presentation. And then we also need to look at the stimulus-response compatibility, looking at spatial and anatomical relationships and the compatibility and complexity of the actions in our responses there. Again, we'll talk about these in the next several slides. So, stimulus result alternatives, okay? One of the most important factors influencing the time it takes to start an action or a reaction time there is the number of possible response options. And here, this diagram to the right here shows an example of this, okay? So at the bottom is number of possible responses to a stimulus, and on the left here is our reaction time. What you'll notice, and it makes sense, the number of possible responses that we could choose from there, the more options we have, the longer our reaction time is going to be. And that would make sense. If I got several different things to choose from there, it's probably going to take me longer to choose the correct response. So for example, if I have 9 different options on how I'm going to respond, for example, again, using that basketball example, okay, if I'm guarding an opponent, the opponent could pass it. They could shoot it. They could run right with it. They could run left with it. They could dribble. They could fake, do a pump fake. So a lot of different alternatives of what they're going to do. So my reaction to my opponent might be a lot slower there. Now compare that to one possible response. For example, using a sprint start, you hear the gun, your only response is going to be sprint out of it. So my response to the gun is going to be a lot faster compared to my response looking at my opponent when guarding them in basketball. Now, another thing to note is that the largest increase in reaction time is going from one possible response to 2 possible responses. So, for example, let's use the reaction time example again. Maybe on the gun there, you have an option to sprint forward or turn around and sprint backwards. So you got 2 different response options, okay? So now that's going to be a lot faster than having 9 different responses to choose from, okay? But it's going to have the largest change in reaction time, okay? Going from 1 to 2 possible responses, okay? Than it is going, for example, from 7 possible responses to 8 possible responses. So between the 1 to 2 possible response options is always going to be the biggest increase in reaction time, but understand that with adding more responses, the reaction time will continue to increase infinitely. Stimulus response compatibility, okay? The extent to which the stimulus and response are connected, okay, in a natural way, okay? Here's a compatible example, okay? So for example, if a ball is thrown toward the right side of your body, it is compatible and is natural that you would catch that ball with your right hand. A non-compatible example is if you throw that ball to the right side again, but if you catch it with your left hand, that would be a non-compatible response. Because it makes sense, ball's on the right side, so you'd catch it with your right hand. It wouldn't make sense that you would have to reach over with your left hand to catch the ball that's going towards your right side. Okay? So how compatible a response is, okay, to the stimulus, okay, can affect reaction time. And specifically, the more compatible a response is, this leads to a faster reaction time or a decreased reaction time there. So in this example up here, okay, catching the ball with your right hand, if it's thrown to your right side, is going to have a faster reaction time compared to moving your left hand over to catch the ball being thrown to your right side. Now looking at just responses there, the complexity of the response will affect reaction time there. As complexity increases, reaction time will increase. So for example, let's take a look at this situation. Let's say when a light turns on, you perform some sort of action. And the three different actions we're looking at is, number one, move your finger. Second possible response to the light turning on is move your arm. And the third possible response is to move your arm and leg. In terms of reaction time, moving your finger is going to be the fastest. So the light turns on, you move your finger, that will be the fastest reaction time. Next fastest will be moving your arm. It's going to be slower than the reaction time than moving your finger because moving your arm is more complex due to having to incorporate more muscles and larger muscles at that in your movement. Because moving your fingers only involves a few different muscles and they're very small in nature versus moving your arm, you've got a lot of different muscles in your arms and those muscles are bigger. Therefore, and not only that, but your arms is heavier, therefore bringing in more complexity to the movement. So moving your arm in response to a light moving on is a slower reaction time. And then finally, having to move your arm with your leg when the light turns on is going to be the slowest because it's the most complex movement and we're moving the most amount of muscles in this particular thing. So again, as the response complexity increases, our reaction time will also increase. Now, let's combine compatibility and complex actions. Okay? When the stimulus there requires a complex action, okay, the stimulus response compatibility and responsible selection seem to be related to the intentions of the particular action. Let's take a look at an example. A glass is on the table. How will you flip the glass over? And I would recommend watching these two videos and looking at the timestamps in these videos. Okay? So option number one is flipping this glass over, starting in an awkward position to finishing in a comfortable position, meaning you pick up the cup there with your thumb down, okay, and then you finish with setting the cup down with your thumb up. Again, look at the video if you're a little bit confused on what I mean. Option two there, having a comfortable starting position to an awkward finish, meaning that I pick the cup up with my thumb up and then finish it with placing the cup down with my thumb down. In this case here, we got two complex actions. So which one is going to be faster? The option one will be faster and have a shorter reaction time. And that's because our bodies will oftentimes trade off an awkward early position, okay, in this case here, thumb down, okay, for a more comfortable final position where the thumb is up. So the response is defined not in terms of initial interaction, how we initially interact with the cup, but rather in terms of the efficiency of the final position. So again, the summary of this slide here is that we want to finish simple, even if it means starting a little bit more complex. Finally, looking at that movement stage programming, the third part in that human portion of our model. Okay. So again, we started with the stimulus identification, followed by response selection, finished with movement programming. Okay. So we've identified that stimulus, response has been selected, and now this idea must be translated into a set of muscular actions. Okay. And this is going to probably requiring the following. We're going to have to retrieve some sort of action programming from our memory. So looking at history and memory there and what we've done in the past. We've got to prepare the particular program, okay, for movement there, for action. The motor system has to be ready for the program, a feed-forward mechanism, and then we have to initiate that particular movement. Now, anticipation can help with some of this reaction time because what anticipation is knowing or predicting ahead of time what kind of stimuli will be presented and therefore knowing what kind of response will be required based on that stimuli. Okay. So by anticipating, we can process that information ahead of time there to bypass the response selection stage there, okay, in the decision-making process. Okay. Especially if all the information is given in advance. So if we've got all the information ahead of time, it just becomes a simple reaction time task because we know all the stimuli, so we know what exactly the response is going to be when we need to give it. And there's two different types of anticipation. There's spatial, otherwise known as event anticipation, and there's temporal, aka timing anticipation. So temporal, letter T, timing, spatial is going to be event anticipation. An example of spatial anticipation would be hitting a pitch. Okay? In spatial anticipation, reaction time is decreased even when the information is incomplete, as long as some information is cued in advance. Okay, so reason hitting a pitch in baseball would be an example of spatial anticipation is the batter can see the pitcher winding up. So by seeing the pitcher winding up, the batter knows when that pitch roughly will be released from the pitcher's hand. So the batter can get ready and set ready to hit the pitch by the time the pitcher throws the ball. Now the batter doesn't know all information because the batter doesn't know what type of pitch they're going to throw. We don't know where the pitcher is going to throw it, and we don't know at what speed the pitcher is going to throw that pitch. So again, there's some information we don't know, but by seeing spatially, seeing the event of the pitcher starting to wind up, the batter can anticipate some of it, which in turn there will decrease their reaction time. Now, altogether, their spatial anticipation provides a modest reduction in reaction time. So there's a decrease in reaction time, but maybe not nearly as much as one may expect. What typically is going to be creates a stronger decrease in reaction time is going to be temporal anticipation. So for example, counting down to start a race. Okay, so if the subject can anticipate when the stimulus will arrive, reaction time will be decreased by a lot. Especially, for example, if you're counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. If you're saying 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go in a steady, consistent sequence there, okay, the athlete there can time when to start accelerating out from the starting position and therefore decrease significantly that reaction time. So in temporal anticipation, we can eliminate much of the reaction time, possibly even all of it. Here's some examples of anticipation in sports. Okay? Some sports with their rules are try to discourage early responding. Okay? So for example, in track and field, in sprinting races, the start is, or the races are electronically timed. And there's actually a penalty that if the reaction time is less than 100 milliseconds or less, that's considered to be a disqualification for the sprinter. In fact, the United States a few years ago had a male hurdler who actually was disqualified due to this. His reaction time was under 100 milliseconds there. Okay. So again, the reason why they have this rule in place is that they are assuming that the athlete is the reaction time is so small, okay, that they're assuming that's going to be a result of a good guess and an early response versus athlete actually reacting to the gun. Some sports let you know exactly when you can start, but do not be any earlier than that. For example, in drag racing, okay, the green light will go off 0.4 seconds after the amber lights are shown. So therefore, you could decrease your reaction time to 0, okay, but again, can't be early there due to causing a disqualification. Some sports see anticipation will benefit one side, whereas it will hurt their opponents on the other. For example, in football, the offense knows the snap count there, so they can react more favorably in their movements there to the ball being snapped, versus the defense has to wait until the ball actually moves before they can react there. So therefore, it puts the defense at a disadvantage. In some sports, they use anticipation to make things work better for all people. So for example, in couples dancing there, they might count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? Or different other cues there to help keep the dancers in step there. So again, some different examples of anticipation in sports. So with reaction time and choosing which sort of response we want to have, typically we take our responses and choose them from memory, okay? Because our body is influenced heavily by our memory, okay? Previously processed information influences current information processing. So if we have previously processed information about the environment that we're competing in, we can use this this information that we processed previously to give us more information on how to react in this particular situation. Another example of this might be if you're studying an opponent, you might go through their plays ahead of time and memorize what common plays their opponent does so we can anticipate, okay, how we should respond when we actually compete against the opponent. In addition, the current state of a person's skills and knowledge reflects the previous information processing. So basically, how skilled an athlete is currently there, okay, reflects on all the information and stuff that they have learned and practiced beforehand. With memory, there are three different memory systems, and I would make a note of these in your notes somewhere, and I would highlight the main points. We've got short-term sensory store, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So starting with short-term memory store, this retains information for a very short amount of time, essentially less than 1 second and practically about 250 milliseconds. So essentially a quarter of a second is roughly the total amount of time that the short-term sensory store will retain information. Okay. Now the nice thing about the short-term sensory store is it can store perhaps a limitless amount of information. So basically an infinite amount of information the short-term sensory store can hold. But with that there, since it can hold a ton of information for a short period of time, the short-term sensory store does not analyze the information very much. The information is stored very literally there. Okay? And typically, we remember this information in terms of spatial location and form. Here's one example of storing memory in short-term sensory store. So if you're at a desk there and you see your pen next to you, okay? You look away to grab your notebook, and at the same time as you're going to grab your notebook, you simultaneously reach for that pen that you have just seen next to you. You use your short-term sensory memory storage space to guide your hand to the exact location. Okay? This location is not stored for any amount of time beyond that particular use. So again, we know it's there. We reach for the other book, and at the same time, out of our vision there, we're also reaching for that pen. And we can grab that pen because we have seen it previously and the information was stored for a short time in our short-term sensory store. Next up is we got our short-term memory. So short-term memory is different from short-term sensory store. This is a temporary holding place for information. And unlike the short-term sensory store, the short-term memory can retain information for up to 60 seconds. Now, practically there's a lot, we forget a lot of the information that we've stored in those 60 or that we've stored there within the first 20 seconds. Okay, and we especially see even more losses after that, especially if we do not rehearse or practice either remembering that particular thing or practicing the skill over and over again. Now, again, as I mentioned previously, compared to the short-term sensory store, the short-term memory holds the information that's received a lot longer. Okay, but again, we still forget about it quickly if we do not maintain attention to it. Another fact about the short-term memory store is that it can store about 7 plus or minus 2 items or chunks of information at a time. So basically, roughly between 5 to 9 items or 5 to 9 chunks of information our short-term memory can store at any one period of time. An example of a chunk would be like, for example, if you've got words, okay, words are essentially chunks of letters. So if you remember a word there, you're remembering a chunk of letters. Okay, so that's kind of what example of what chunk would be. Now, with short-term memory, it has a much more abstract way in our memory coding information in the short-term memory store. Our short-term memory is related to consciousness, and it consists of information that we are consciously aware of. Not the subconscious, but what we're consciously aware of. Working memory is another term that refers to short-term memory. Okay? Essentially, okay, the idea of working memory is that a part of the short-term memory where information is stored from the short-term sensory store can be stored for processing. Okay? And a part of the short-term memory, okay, where information can be pulled from the long-term memory and integrated with the information received from the short-term sensory store. Okay? So essentially, basically, short-term memory pulls information from the short-term sensory store and from long-term memory, okay, and uses that information there to learn and to practice and to get better again. Our working memory, okay, contains items in a high-level anticipation for rapid access. So essentially, it'll store that information to help you anticipate quickly to a particular given situation. So working memory includes the choice of actions, that you want to make there, making this working memory there closely related to the response selection stage. And finally, the third type of memory we've got is long-term memory. So it can return essentially an unlimited amount of information for a very long period of time. So the nice thing again is that it can store unlimited amount of information. Okay? But from a motor perspective there, long-term memory seems to store continuous movements better than discrete movements. So essentially long-term memory will help you better perform continuous movements like jogging, biking, swimming, okay, compared to discrete movements, something like throwing a baseball, or maybe kicking a soccer ball, or maybe it's doing a vertical jump. Additionally, their long-term memory, the coding of that memory appears to be very abstract. One example there is that the smell of something might help you remember the event, some sort of event or place there, just due to that smell. Long-term memory has an interesting relationship to motor skills. Okay? Specifically there, cognitive psychology of memory might not apply to motor skills. And here's an example. You might recall the result of a movement, but not the actual movement itself. Okay? It's one reason why you might talk to gifted athletes and you ask them, how did you shoot that amazing shot at the buzzer there to beat the opponents? And they'd say, I don't know, I just went and I did it. Okay? So sometimes performing these movements from these long-term memory automatically there, we don't have knowledge of how we did it. We just have knowledge that we did it. So essentially skilled movement, people very high level of performers there, appear to execute their movements there and skills without much conscious awareness of what they're actually doing. So I mark this somewhere down in your notes there. This essentially is a summary of the three different types of memory, okay, and three different categories, okay. Short-term sensory store does not store a lot information very long, less than a second. Short-term memory store information for up to 60 seconds, and long-term memory can store memory for essentially a limitless amount of time. The type of coding for that memory, short-term sensory store, is very literal, okay. Short-term memory goes a little bit more abstract. Long-term memory is a very abstract way of coding that memory. As for capacity, short-term sensory store and the long-term memory store has basically unlimited amount of information they can store in their duration of time, versus short-term memory can only store 5 to 9 items or chunks of information at any one time. Attention. So definition for attention there is that attention is very limited. Okay, essentially we can pay attention to, or we can focus on, I should say, a finite amount of things at any one time. So essentially a chunk of information at one time is only the things that we can pay attention to. Okay, so attention is limited. Attention is also very selective. Okay, meaning that we can choose, okay, what to pay attention to while ignoring other things. So with attention there, there's a limited amount of attention that can be applied there to current tasks. And depending on the complexity of the task there might not be enough attention available, okay, to focus on 2 or more complicated tasks at the same time. Okay. The amount of attention we allocate there or give to each task shifts with the different changing demands of those particular tasks. So essentially, attention is focusing on things, but understanding that attention is limited and it's very selective. So how does attention and consciousness, how do they relate there? Okay. Definition of consciousness is what we are aware of at any given point of time there. And with consciousness, it can be difficult to measure how much we're aware of something without functional magnetic resonance imaging, or TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. Essentially fancy machines there that could measure this stuff. Okay. So therefore, oftentimes, okay, it'd be nice to measure consciousness, but we just don't have the tools to be able to do it without having to shell out thousands of dollars. Okay. Controlled processing is a term for conscious processing. Okay, so our abilities to consciously process information there, okay, it's very important, okay. Unfortunately, due to aging there, this is susceptible to decline. It's one reason why that um, people who are older, okay, oftentimes have a greater risk of suffering from dementia or some sort of other disease or ailment there that affects their memory, okay, so because they have trouble consciously processing the information they receive on a daily basis with age. With attention, there's automatic processing, okay, which is unconscious processing, okay, and this is fortunately well preserved through aging, okay. So, for example, someone who's very old there, they might hear a song, okay, from their childhood, okay, and that memory of remembering something from their childhood there, okay, they, whether it be a smell, sound, whatnot there, they remember it so much that they can retain that memory across their lifespan well. Okay. Additionally, there, okay, due to difficulties with controlled processing but remembering automatic processing, these both lead to difficulty in breaking old habits. Okay, and that's due to automatic action, okay, of old habits there not successfully being inhibited by controlled processing, especially with aging. So as we get older there, it can be difficult to break the old habits that we've already converted to automatic processing. So these two pictures right here kind of give an idea of looking at attention there as a finite capacity or a resource there, okay? We know that attention is limited, so therefore there's a finite amount of attention that we can give at any one time. Okay? So if we're trying to do two tasks simultaneously, okay, we have to devote certain chunks of our attention to each of those tasks. Okay? Let's take a look at two different options there. We've got option A, okay, where we've got a simple primary task, okay, that we don't have to devote a whole ton of time to, and therefore we can devote a lot more time there to our attention to the secondary task. For example, chewing gum and walking. Okay? Chewing gum is a simple primary task. It doesn't take a whole lot of attention there to focus on chewing gum. Okay? And therefore, because I can chew gum pretty easily there, my chewing gum and walking probably won't affect each other. I'll probably be able to chew gum efficiently and walk efficiently. Option B is looking at a complex primary task, leaves not enough capacity there for good performance on a secondary task. An example of this might be juggling and walking. So juggling is a very complex primary task, okay? And because it's very complex, I need to put a ton of attention, okay, towards focusing on juggling and not dropping the balls. And therefore, if I'm trying to juggle and walk at the same time, I'm probably going to be walking slower because I can't walk very fast due to me having to focus on juggling the balls. So in option B here, okay, having difficulty walking, okay, when you're focusing on juggling is due to this idea of interference. Okay, so essentially what interference is considered to be a measure of the amount of attention required for a given task. Over here would be an examples here, okay? Let's take a look at, this is an example of like option A. So option A here, okay, we got chewing gum is like green, okay? And green we only have to devote a certain amount of attention to in order to chew gum well. Therefore, it gives us a lot of attention that's left and available for us to focus on walking. Versus option B would be like here. Juggling is like this green where we have to focus most of our attention on it. Therefore, we can focus a limited amount of attention on walking. Therefore, our walking performance will be hurt in this example down here versus won't be hurt in this example up here. So this interplay, okay, of interference and attention. If two tasks, like chewing gum and walking there, can be performed as well simultaneously as they can individually, at least one of them does not require a portion of this limited capacity of attention. Okay? Basically meaning that either chewing gum or walking, or possibly even both, are going to be considered to be automatic. If one of the two tasks show diminished performance, for example, if juggling was hurt, or if walking was hurt due to juggling, okay, then both of these, juggling and walking, require some portion of this capacity of attention. Okay? Meaning that both tasks require a good chunk of attention. Okay? Therefore, interference comes into play. Okay? And this interference comes into play there, and it helps us determine if a task requires that particular attention. So again, if performance is hurt there, okay, that means that that particular task there brought interference to the other task. So there's a couple different types of interference that we are going to look at there. There's structural interference and capacity interference. What structural interference is that it's the result of when physical or neurological structures are the source of your decrement in performance. For example here, your eyes can only focus on one signal source at a time. Okay? For example, to text and drive, okay, that doesn't work there. Your focus is either on driving or your focus is on texting there. Okay? When you focus on one or the other there, your performance in the other is going to suffer. Okay? So for example, if I'm driving, there's no way I will not be able to text very well. If I am able to text at all there, it's probably going to be very poor in nature. I'm probably going to make a lot of misspellings because I got to focus on the road. Likewise there, if I'm focused just on texting, my eyes are not on the road, so I'm not sure if I'm staying in the lines there. Therefore, my driving performance will be more poor. So that's an example there of structural interference. Capacity interference states that if structural interference can be ruled out there, we think that capacity interference is what's causing the decrease in performance. Okay? And this is due to a limitation in your capacity, okay, for your brain there to focus on both tasks at one time. For example there, okay, while driving in heavy traffic, it becomes a lot more difficult to carry on a conversation. Okay? So if I'm driving a lot of traffic and people are flying by me, and I focus on stopping and starting, okay, my conversation with my co-pilot there is going to be a lot more, it's going to be broken up a lot more. I'm probably going to have trouble remembering things because I got to focus more on the road there and less on talking with that particular person. So with our attention there, we can be selective with it, okay? Meaning that we can focus on different things at certain different points in time, okay, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. And this attention can either be intentional, meaning we're actually trying to pay attention to something, or it could be incidental, meaning we're not meaning to pay attention to it, but due to something, it breaks our attention away of what we're currently focusing on to focusing on that new stimuli. So an example of intentional selective attention is that we can have a conversation with somebody if we're in a loud, crowded, noisy room. One reason why at restaurants there, you can still talk with somebody because you can ignore the people talking around you. So essentially intentional attention there, selective attention there, is purposely trying to focus on one thing while ignoring attention to other things. An example of incidental selective attention would be that if we hear a loud sound, as we're talking to someone, we might turn to look at where the loud sound came from. So by turning to look where that loud sound came from, it's because an incident, okay, or incidental opportunity there caused us to shift our attention from the person we're talking to that loud noise. Now, how can we kind of explain attention there and explain why attention is sometimes works well in some situations and why sometimes it's poor in other situations? And there's several different theories of attention out there, okay? One kind of, I guess, category or theory of attention would be the single channel filter theories, okay? What these theories do is that they assume that there's a fixed capacity of attention, okay? Meaning that you have a finite amount of attention that you can give at any one time. Okay? With these attentions, they're oftentimes termed as bottleneck theories, okay? And what these mean is that there's some point in time, as we're paying attention there, okay, that there will be a place where we aren't able to process all the information that's out there due to some sort of event or thing there that bottlenecks us or helps eliminate our ability to effectively take in all the stimuli around us. Okay? essentially limiting the information there so that only one operation can occur at a time. Now, where this location of this bottleneck occurs, okay, depends on the theory. Okay, some think that the bottleneck occurs early on, so there's an early bottleneck. Okay, meaning that while we're taking in all this stimuli there, okay, there's some early parallel processing, meaning we're taking in a bunch of different pieces of information at one time and going through it simultaneously. Okay, but at some point in time, okay, oftentimes in the stimulus identification stage, one of the tasks that we are trying to do will face greater interference or be blocked. Okay. The other location of the bottleneck might be a late filter or a late bottleneck, the bottleneck typically occurring in the response selection stage. Okay. So this is kind of an example of what I was just showing or just describing just previously there. Okay. We've got the human part of reacting, okay, and choosing a response there. Identify the stimulus, response selection, and movement programming. So choosing which movement to do. Okay. Now, with these theories of attention there, okay, there's kind of a revised view on these single channel view of attention there. Okay. Single channel does seem to exist, okay, but it doesn't apply to all stages of processing. Okay. For example, there we can do a lot of parallel processing occurring in the early stages of the information processing part. So for example, in the stimulus identification and response selection situations there, we can identify many different stimuli at one time there, and we can go through a lot of different possible responses at any one time, okay? But where the bottleneck is going to occur is going to be around the response selection or response programming stage. So essentially there is roughly, okay, around the movement programming part is when we got to choose from all of our different options there, choose the one option that will help us the best. And due to our limited amount of attention during this time there, okay, this is where the bottleneck typically occurs and slows things down. So I mentioned parallel processing. Let's talk about it a little bit more. Okay, so essentially parallel processing can occur in the stimulus identification phase for some tasks. For example, okay, if you take a look outside and down the road you see a large green truck driving, okay? So this is parallel processing a bunch of different variables at one time. We got a large green truck. All those are different types of stimuli. We got size, we got color, and we've got whatever object it is. Okay. For other tasks we're trying to do, the information that we receive exceeds our capacity, requires that we switch attention. Okay, and there's two different ways we can switch attention. One is considered the Stroop effect. Okay, and what the Stroop effect is a demonstration of parallel processing in the stimulus identification phase. Okay, the delay occurs in the response selection or response programming phase. Okay, when we got two different responses are competing. Okay. Another one of these parallel processing phenomenons is the cocktail party phenomenon. Okay, example of this would be is that you're in a loud crowded room and you're having a conversation and you don't understand or hear what other people are saying there until someone mentions your name. Okay, and when your person mentions your name, you perk up. Ooh, I heard my name. And clearly in this situation, you are processing both stimuli simultaneously, both your conversation there and then hearing your name there. But you only switched attention when it was needed, essentially when your brain actually heard your name there. So parallel processing, intentional and incidental attention. In some activities, we can't block out parallel information even with effort to do so. For example, that Stroop effect there. Okay. Some activities allow us to selectively filter out unwanted information. Okay, yet be receptive to important information when it does arise there. For example, that cocktail party phenomenon I just talked about. Okay. Now, there are times when intentional processing inhibits or prevents the processing of other sensory events. However, this intentional or preventing the processing of other events could have dangerous consequences. So, for example, if you're watching oncoming traffic, we might not see a pedestrian crossing when this is happening there. So we don't want these parts where we're not paying attention to the person crossing the street because our attention is focused on the road. Okay? This idea of not being able to focus on some things, okay, due to other stimuli, okay, one of these things is called inattentional blindness. Okay, so essentially, what inattentional blindness is that failing to see certain things, okay, when you're focused on other things. An example of this would be to watch this video here, okay, where you're focused on people throwing this ball around, and in the background of this particular video, again, click it, go watch it for yourself if you'd like, a person in a gorilla suit walks behind. And for a lot of people watching this video, because they're focused so much on the passing, they don't notice that gorilla watching through. So because their attention is focused on people passing the ball and not on the gorilla walking through, that would be considered inattentional blindness. Another type of blindness out there is change blindness. Okay? In this example here, this TED Talk, this pickpocket guy, he changes his shirt in the middle of his performance without most, if not all, of the audience noticing there. So with the single channel processing there, okay, while early stages of information can process information in parallel there, by that movement programming stage, as we've talked about previously, it appears that only one movement can be initiated at a time. Okay, and this is one reason why that fakes in sports, okay, can be so effective. Okay, for example, if a basketball player is faking a shot, they could get somebody to jump up in the air, okay, and therefore getting that opponent to jump in the air, they can dribble by them because they've gotten them to already jump in the air. And this single processing can possibly be due to output chunking. Okay, so essentially, what research has shown is that once a response is initiated, so essentially you're responding to the situation. In the basketball example, okay, if the defender sees the person going up for a shot, the person starts to jump, okay, to try to block the shot. Okay, what research has shown is that once the response is initiated, in this case, jumping to block the shot there's a minimum amount of time before another response can be initiated. Okay, and this depends on, again, the situation there, but this is approximately 200 milliseconds. Okay, so basically, this person's already executed their movement, and as they're jumping, they see the person bringing the ball down to start dribbling, and the person's already jumping, so they try to stop their jump. Okay, but it takes about 200 milliseconds for that person trying to stop their jump and get back on the ground quickly to stay with the person they are guarding. Okay. So this begs the question here is how do we see individual movements occurring in less than 200 milliseconds apart? Okay, and this is due to output chunking. Okay, because one response, again, one movement pattern there, okay, one response to a given stimuli there may contain numerous elements combined into a single unit called controlled by a motor program. So already executing the motor program of jumping in the air to block the ball there, okay, and we're executing that, okay, and then when we see the person go around, we try to change that motor program, but by then it oftentimes is too late. So when we're processing information, okay, it begs us to understand here, when does automatic processing of the information occur and when does controlled processing occur? Okay, and what are the pros and cons of this? Okay, so when we're choosing our response there, okay, here are some limitations there. Okay, so in a controlled processing of information, for example, okay, if you look at your best friend's phone number, the question is, we're trying to process is, does your best friend's phone number have a 5 in it? Okay, so the way we would probably go about this here is that we would look at the first digit. Is that a 5? Yes or no? If no, move on to the second digit. Is that a 5 or no? Yes or no? No, go on to the next digit. So in a controlled processing example there, it's very slow in nature. Okay? It is very attention demanding, meaning that we probably can't do many other things while we're trying to focus on this one thing. Controlled processing typically is serial in nature, meaning one thing has to happen before the next thing can happen. Okay? And it's strongly volitional, okay, meaning voluntary, meaning it can be started, stopped, or avoided altogether there. Okay? So again, this process of looking at the first digit, the second digit, the third digit, and your best friend's phone number, okay, is very controlled, processed in nature. versus automatic processing. This would be an example of recognizing written words. So unlike trying to figure out if your best friend has a 5 in their phone number there, where you go through each individual digit, words here have a combination of a bunch of letters together to create words. Okay? So this is more automatic processing because we take all those letters there and we know it forms a word. Okay? This processing of information is very fast. Okay? And because it's one reason it's fast is because it's not very attention demanding. It does not interfere with other operations. Okay? When we process this information, we process it parallel in nature, meaning taking a lot of different bits of information at one time and processing it. Okay? Automatic processing also is not volitional. It's not voluntarily. It happens unavoidably without us even trying to think about it. In fact, if you think about it here, try not reading a word. Okay, that can be very difficult to do because the process is automatically processed, or the act of reading is automatic in nature. So how do we go from controlled processing, which is very slow, attention demanding, okay, to more automatic processing? So how do we develop this automaticity? Okay, one way to do this is to practice a lot. Okay, one reason why professional basketball players are able to dribble a basketball and very quickly and be able to move around well and not even look at the ball when they're dribbling is due to all the practice they've done. Okay? Now, developing this automaticity, it develops gradually. Okay, and typically automaticity effectively happens under a consistent mapping condition. Begs the question: what is a consistent mapping condition? Meaning that response generated is consistent to a stimulus pattern. For example, okay, every time you see a red light, you're supposed to stop. So you got stimulus, okay, means stop. Every time the red light is red, you stop. Every time red is light, you stop. So essentially we develop this automaticity there under a consistent mapping condition. Consistent meaning red light, okay, every time that happens, you stop. Now there is also varied mapping condition, okay, which is not good for developing automaticity, okay, meaning that the response is not consistent based off of a specific stimulus pattern. Okay. For example, depending on the house you go into, okay, if you flip a light switch, that light switch could do several different things. It could turn on a light, or it could turn off a light. It could turn on a fan, or it could turn off a fan. It could dim a light, or it could make the light brighter. Okay? It could maybe open a garage door. Okay? It might unlock a door. Okay? So basically there, switches, okay, don't always correspond exactly the way you think they would. So therefore, okay, flipping a light switch might develop less automaticity compared to stopping for a red light. So with attention there, we talked about detention has a limited capacity there, okay? And not only does we deal with capacities there, but with our focus of attention, what exactly are we focusing on, okay? Oftentimes there's two different types of ways that we can focus on different things. We can focus on external things, or we can focus on internal things. So external focus of attention, okay, oftentimes is focusing on things directed to our particular intended movement effect there. Okay, external meaning focusing on something outside of yourself. For example, the flight of the ball. Okay, aiming at a target. Okay, maybe you are a movement goal. You are working on getting to the finish line. Okay, etc. There. So external focus of attention means you're focused on something outside of your body. Okay, versus internal attentional focus means focusing within yourself on your own body movements. For example, focusing on how your wrist flicks there when throwing a ball. Maybe focusing on what position your foot is in when kicking. Okay? Maybe focusing on your breathing. Okay? That's an internal focus of attention. What research has shown is that external focus of attention in the vast majority of situations, vast majority of situations, is going to be more effective than an internal focus of attention, regardless of the type of skill. So for example, lifting weights, maybe shooting, maybe running. So whether you're a novice or an advanced person, okay, uh, depend on your movement ability, your age, or skill level. Regardless of that, they're typically focusing on external focuses of attention is going to be better than internal focus of attention. All right, moving on to motor programs. So again, motor program essentially is it's the particular movement, okay, or set of movements that you're going to choose, and you choose that immediately before you actually execute that movement there. Okay. Now, with the motor programs there, we can modify our motor programs, okay, based off of our environment there, okay. And with this there are two different types of control systems when evaluating our motor programs, okay. One of these types is going to be a closed loop control system, okay. With a controlled loop control or a closed loop control system, okay, there's essentially four different parts, okay. We've got an executive system there, okay, that makes decisions there, essentially. We've got an effector system, okay, for carrying out the decisions. Okay. We've got a comparator, essentially a reference, at which we can, which feedback and feed forward information compared to define whether an error has occurred, okay. And then we got that error signal, okay, which then can be brought back to the beginning there and be used by our executive system to make a change. The reason this is called a closed loop control system is because the loop from the executive, okay, to the effector and back, okay, so executive to the effector and then back there is closed by sensory information, essentially giving feedback there. Now here's an example of this, okay, so closed loop control system, okay, so in your house there, okay, it's too cold in the house. So you set your thermostat to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The executive system puts out a signal to warm the air. Okay. So executive system says warm the air. Okay. Now the expected state, what the executive system wants to get to, is 68 degrees. So following this arrow down here, okay, the expected state, the feed forward information there is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what we expect to get. The furnace is going to be the effector in this example. See, the effector starts warming the air and blowing it out of the house, okay? And let's say, or throughout the house, I should say. And then let's say at some point it gets to 65 degrees, okay? That is the actual state, the feedback, okay? So coming over here, it's actually 65 degrees, but we expect it to be 68 degrees. So the comparator here, okay, figures out expected state 68 degrees, actual state is 65 degrees. So therefore, there's a 3-degree difference between what we expect and what we actually have. Okay, so therefore, we have a 3-degree error. So this 3-degree error there goes back to the beginning. Okay, executive system takes this information, okay, and it tells it that we need to keep warming the house, and then it repeats there, okay, until we get to the actual state being 68 degrees. So if you take that simplified model of the closed loop control system, we can expand it there, okay, to help us understand that how we can control slower movements, okay, or long duration movements regulation there, like holding your particular posture. Okay. So basically, the closed loop control system only works for slow movements or movements that occur for a long period of time. So stimulus identification, response selection, movement programming, what we anticipate to be feedback. We execute a motor program, we get feedback from that, and based on how well our motor program does and the anticipated feedback, we either have an error coming back or it tells us, hey, we're doing well and we need to just maintain. Okay. So closed loop control systems do not work for fast movements because for fast movements, okay, we don't have enough time there to get feedback from the system there. So therefore, for fast movements, error corrections have to be given after the movement has been completed. So closed loop control systems are great for slow movements, but they are very poor for fast movements. So it talks about feedback versus feed forward information. Okay, feed forward information is what we anticipate to get, okay, or what is expected. In our example previously, it was that we expect to get the furnace to be 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. Now this feed-forward information is provided at the end of the information processing portion, versus the feedback is the actual results of the movements. The current temperature in our thermostat example, in our particular example, again, it was 65 degrees. And this is provided at the end of the movement, okay, the effector portion. Okay. So again, we compare the feedback with the feed-forward information. So essentially here, okay, this gray line is feedback, okay, and this blue line right here essentially will be the feed-forward information. So again, these two are compared to determine whether there's an error or not. If there's an error, okay, steps are taken to correct that error, we make a change, okay, or no error, we don't need to change anything. As I mentioned previously, the closed-loop control system is relatively slow, okay, and it's especially slow if there's a large amount of time is needed to process all the information, okay, if we need high demand for different resources or both. Okay. Number two, closed-loop control systems limits tracking tasks, okay, meaning that one of the more common motor control tasks we perform, like driving a car, is considered to be a tracking task. Okay. In addition, it's limited in rapid discrete tasks. They happen too fast. Okay. So again, closed loop control systems are great for slow movements. Now let's take a look at this example. Okay, has this example ever happened to you? You're at an intersection with a traffic light, and you're the only car there, okay, but the light is red. There are no sensors to detect your car at this particular stoplight. Okay, so you sit through the entire stoplight cycle. So it's still going to remain red there. Okay, eventually it turn green. Okay, but since the sensor is not there to tell the light to turn green for you, you're going to sit there until that light turns green. Okay, this would be an example of an open loop process, not a closed loop, but an open loop process, meaning that a plan has been created and it will be followed with no regard to any feedback. Okay. The plan being, we are going to sit at the stoplight here until it turns green. So with our open loop control system, notice here we still got our input, executive, effector, and output, okay, but we don't have any feedback part. Okay. So essentially there's no feedback loops, okay, and reference for correctiveness. Essentially, the executive system sends a package of instructions or a program to the effector, and the effector carries out the instructions without the possibility of modifications if something goes wrong as it's carrying it about. Because with no feedback, there's no modification needed to happen. Okay. So while this is effectively the opposite of a closed loop, which closed loop has feedback there, should not be seen as opposed to a closed loop system. Both are important to successful performance. So again, this slide kind of summarizes closed loop versus open loop. Okay. I would mark this somewhere down in your notes there. Okay. Closed loop systems dependent on feedback for making corrections, okay, depending on the stage of processing you're in. Okay. There's reflexes, okay, base corrections or compensations, okay, that are not mediated by stages of processing. Good example of a closed loop system would be balancing on one leg. Versus an open loop system, okay, the instructions of the motor program we're going to choose there are structured in advance and executed, okay, without any regards to the effects the movement may have on the environment. Okay. Essentially, an open loop system then again is not sensitive to feedback. The example again is the car sitting at the red light, okay, from the previous slide until the light turns green. That's all I got. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good day. Booyah!